All right, so my presentation this morning is or afternoon, evening. It's just after 11 here in Jamaica. So I'm gonna use the Kingston earthquake of 1907 as an example towards a redefining of absence heritage. And we also want to plug in that we can use this absence heritage to promote awareness, which eventually leads to better resilience. So thanks very much to the IGCP 692 team for the invitation. So this presentation, I'll have a little background. I'm going to take this in three parts. The first one is about the earthquake itself and the damage that occurred. The second part is the current concepts and the usage of absence heritage. And the third part is about increasing awareness and some suggested methodologies. So basically, this is Jamaica. We're in the Greater Antilles. We're the third largest island in the Greater Antilles. We're south of Florida. We're east of Central America and south of Canada, yes. And we're north of South America. So if you hadn't gotten to your Jamaican geography, this is where we're located, basically in the Central Caribbean. Seismically, we are very active. And if you look at the first image, you will see that we're part of this belt of earthquakes. I mean, Hispaniola is completely obliterated by earthquakes. And one commonality between us and Hispaniola is that in Haiti, the Haiti earthquake of 2010, the same fault, the Enriquillo Plant and Garden Fault, actually runs through eastern Jamaica along the Plant and Garden River. And it forms part of the southern boundary of the Gonaive microplate. So we are in a tectonically active zone, and as such, earthquakes are basically a way of life. Jamaica experiences about 200 earthquakes per year, and as such, being earthquake ready is very, very necessary for us. So this is a geological map of Jamaica. And I wanted to point out very quickly that towards the northeast here is where it was suggested that the fault that caused the earthquake in Kingston might have been located. There are two locations, and this is one of them. And it is also proposed that there could be a South Coast fault. So yes, there was a seismograph on the island at the time, but it was rendered disabled during the earthquake. So no data could have been taken from it. But I will give you some additional information, some evidence that might suggest these two locations. So tectonically, this is how these are the major faults. And the minor ones have not been added because then it would obliterate a lot of the geology I'm about to show you. So what is important here is that the city of Kingston is built on alluvium, right? And my university is right here, almost like in the fork of this forefinger, right? And this is the Plant and Garden Fault, which is the extension of the Enriquillo Plant and Garden Fault system. So this is generally how our geology is. We have identified, Mitchell has identified about 40 or more inliers. And so essentially a lot of our rocks, our basement is Cretaceous, and we go all the way up to this limestone. This is a parish map of Jamaica showing you Kingston here. And I will point out areas along this northeastern coast in a little while for other reasons. But this is Kingston, just to give you an idea of where we are situated within the entire context of the island. This is a map of Kingston, and it's just meant to show you what the layout was back in 1907. And it's a historic layout. This has been the layout for as far back as Kingston was once it became developed and organized. excuse me, and this layout is still the same layout. I'll show you a picture in a minute what the layout is today, and it is very much the same streets and streets and lanes. The entire layout, this grid pattern, is very reminiscent of a colonial town. This I wanted to point out. This is called Racecourse, and Racecourse is now called National Heroes Park or Heroes Circle. The National Heroes Park is located there. This is Heroes Circle. Our national heroes are buried there, just as a little bit of tidbit there. But what is important about this for the earthquake? A circus was being run at this location at the time of the earthquake. And so the circus tents became a place of refuge for people who lost their homes and were not able to be anywhere after they were displaced by the earthquake. So this one is just to show you that it's the same grid pattern, the same streets, everything within the city of Kingston. And I'm just going to point out quickly some streets that you'll probably hear me mention throughout the presentation. Tower Street is one of them, and it runs, excuse me, it runs, I'm sorry, runs east-west almost. And East Street runs north-south, so does Duke Street and King Street. These are some of the streets that I will mention in the presentation. I don't expect you to remember them all, but just in terms of orientation, that they are basically north trending roads or east-west trending roads. All right. In terms of earthquake history, Jamaica has a very strong earthquake history, no pun intended. And these are some of the major earthquakes. So we had Port Royal in 1692, and of course we're discussing 1907. And most recently, these are some of the quakes that we've had with their magnitudes. And this 7.7 was out in the Cayman Trough, and we had ranges of 5.5 down to about 4 in Jamaica. All right. So that said, we're at part 2, and I thought starting out about the earthquake and its damage to use this headline from the Jamaica Daily Telegraph from January 22, 1907. City of Kingston wrecked by earthquake on Monday 14th. And this was about a week later, and it was the headlines. It tells you that prominent merchants had died, much in the same way that our now newspapers would have carried something like this. The difference is this would be all over CNN, and we would be living an earthquake basically on TV, which is, you know, another dimension to awareness. This also is an interesting picture because it indicates right here the time on the clock. This is the St. Andrew, the Kingston Parish Church, and the clock says 3:31. The earthquake actually occurred around that time. Some people recorded 3:30, some recorded 3:31, and we have times up to 3:33 in the afternoon. So it occurred on January 14th, that we know. It lasted 35 seconds, and there were variations in the intensity over the course of that, in the ground shaking over the course of that 35 seconds. Then the intensity has been estimated at a 9. There were aftershocks, about 80 of them up to February 5. There were probably up to nearly 200 aftershocks up until the summer, if I remember clearly. And it is suggested that about 85% of the buildings were destroyed by both the shaking and the subsequent fire. And areas that were severely damaged, I'm going to show you those on a map in a moment. So this is an interesting little map because this was where Brown, with some of the work from, I think, Cornish back in 1908, they attempted to put in isoseismals according to how people felt the earthquake and what was happening on the ground. And I thought I'd just show that because this was seismology at its best back in 1907. So here, I wanted to point out that there was in fact a tsunami. And the tsunami locations, excuse me, I don't know what's happening. Tsunami locations in St. Anne's Bay in the north, Port Maria, Anota Bay, Buff Bay, Hope Bay, and Port Antonio. It was suggested that there was actually a change in height of about 3 meters in these locations. The water actually receded that much before you had the run up of the actual tsunami. And then, of course, being the bottleneck that the Kingston Harbor is, it only experienced some seaches. So this is one of the reasons, along with some collapse that took place in Buff Bay, why they were suggesting that the earthquake occurred as a result of a fault movement along the north coast. But then it didn't explain the destruction in Kingston, and so the south coast fault was also suggested. And without other evidence, we can't pinpoint exactly. In terms of the fire, this is the apex of the fire here, and it sort of burned in this almost triangular pattern and destroyed everything in its path. And it started, this is where we'd call South Parade, and it went all the way down to the coast. So we had the apex is actually, remember that church in the picture with the clock that said 1531? That is the church right at the apex of all of this. So I just wanted to show that. The rest of the image is not readable, just my triangle. So this is a view of Kingston. This is King Street heading towards the north. And this is around 1897 to 1902, kind of. I got this image from a colleague. His grandfather would have been in this vicinity at this time. But we couldn't pinpoint exactly when, because he made more than one trips. So here, if you look far off in the distance, you will see a steeple. I don't know if you're seeing it. I'll put my pointer to the top of that. And if you look straight across, you'll see a nice steeple. It is the same church that had the clock on it. And that's the Kingston Parish Church. And we will have more views, especially after the destruction, so you can see this as a reference point. So we're looking down King Street, and our view is to the mountains. So we're looking at the foothills of the Blue Mountains, and we're looking directly at the steeple of the St. Andrew of the Kingston Parish Church. Now, this is the view now, post-earthquake, looking up King Street towards the hills again. Now, in this particular case, it's very hazy. It's not a very good picture if you're looking for well-defined things, but you can imagine this is just after a fire. There's still smoke in the air. Everything is cloudy, but we're looking towards the hills, and we're not able to see the parish church nor its steeple. Right? And as you look here, you'll see the tram is mangled from the flames. Everything is just in this path is just completely destroyed. This is King Street again. I think there's a furniture store along this street now. It looks similar but different, if I want to say that. And this is a view going up to the north as well. You can see the outline of the hills in the back. Here is Sailor's Rest. This is before the earthquake. And this is another view. And here is segments of that same street post earthquake. This is the post office. And what we noticed when we were doing our analysis of buildings that had reinforcements like columns and so on, were able to, their second floors held up. But those that were not held up by columns or any kind of strengthening members, they tended to collapse. So you can see the brickwork in between these supports fell off, but you could still see that the supports are intact. So those were some of the observations that we actually made. And of course, this building was not in the path of the fire. This is the Supreme Court. In fact, it's this building down here. That's the Supreme Court building. And this is a close-up. You can see the second floor, and the first floor is held up quite well. And you can see where the brickwork has fallen out. All of this, these observations I'll tie them all together in a minute. This is St. George's Church, and the portico came down because the supports for the portico could not hold the portico up, and as a result it took a lot of other parts of the church with it. And you can see that there are segments of these buildings where you can see where the bricks lost cohesion, and you can see where this section might have been weak, because you can see that the weakness actually went all the way down into the next floor, and you could see it along these supports here. But if you look at the columns on this side, they're pretty much intact. So one of the things that Cornish, for example, was looking at was the direction of where the walls fell to determine, maybe where the waves for the earthquake came from. So that's something I guess one could look at. And he has a map that shows all these arrows of his postulation as to how things occurred. This is the church again, the one I showed you before. This is the Kingston Parish Church. And what is interesting about this is that all the churches that had tall steeples or some kind of spire, the spires fell down and damaged the rest of the church. So you can see this spire actually caved in on itself, and it caused damage to the rest of the structure. So some of those things are interesting to me, because there was, I think in one of Brown's account of the earthquake, when he was doing his analysis, he was suggesting that the church would have held up if it was made out of stone, and that limestone was the rock that was all over Jamaica, and why couldn't stone be used to build the church? But then on closer observation, when they went in and looked at everything, the beams were strong, everything was strong, and they realized that it was the collapse of the spire that really did cause much of the damage to the church. This is the St. Michael's Church, and St. Michael's Church is no more. After it collapsed, it was not rebuilt. And this is one of the reasons I really wanted Absence Heritage to be connected to natural disasters, because this church doesn't exist anywhere. It wasn't rebuilt. There's no sign that says, here lies St. Michael's Church, a casualty of, calamity or something. So it really, it would have been nice to be able to see something. This is Theatre Royal, and Theatre Royal it's a magnificent structure. You can see a lot of statues on the edifice here. You can see the interior. This is a picture, these are pictures from 1897. It was a stately place, still is, and now it's under renovation. This is what was left of it after the quake. Now, if I go back here, you will see the way the artist rendering, you can see that there are basically two buildings, right? So these two edifices have been joined together, and that is where they separated. And it would appear, if you look in this picture, some of the statues from this side no longer exists. They probably helped to bring the roof in. And of course, the other part of the building went in somewhat of a separate direction, but the edifice is strong. It's actually, other than the statues that fell off of it, it's still very imposing. It's still fantastic. It's still just a lovely, lovely edifice. And it's good that I think if I lived around that time and I'm looking at all of this destruction, and I can look at a building that I can still recognize and it hasn't fallen down, it probably would give me some hope. But, that's just me. And this is just another picture, just showing you the two things together, so you could see that. And just here, the front of this one, it shows you where the statues have fallen off. And so it kind of supports the thought that the statues helped to bring the roof down on this side. Oh, there's the statue right there. I have not seen that before. So Said statue probably came down, and here it is, still looking intact from this angle. But yes, you wouldn't find these kinds of things on modern buildings because they would probably fall off and hit somebody in the event of an earthquake. This is the Coke Chapel. And I want to point out a few things on the Coke Chapel that contributed to the damage of this church. These towers, though stately and magnificent, even these embellishments at each corner came crashing down and helped to damage the rest of the edifice. So if you, I'm going to show you the picture very quickly, just for effect. Look at that. And this one, still there, but only partially, right? I'm sure it probably came down eventually with all of those 80 aftershocks by February 5. But you can see that none of the embellishments in the corners still exist, and the towers are gone. And if you look where the towers were and look at the parts of the building, you would see that they would have torn off and probably tore off other parts of the building as they came crashing down. And I'm going about it this way because this is the story that I have gained from these pictures. And I'm sure anybody looking at these pictures would gain their own or similar stories. Here is the front of the church, and you can see almost everything is just in shambles. This is St. Andrew Scots Kirk, and I have to point out that this structure is, the shape of it is, it provides stability, and it's one of the reasons it had relatively minimal damage compared to the other religious structures at the time of the earthquake. And I'm gonna point out this side of the building and this portico. There's a portico on this side and there's a portico on that side, and I'll show you. This is the damage to one end of the building. It wasn't even on the sides with the portico. This was somewhere towards the back of the building. And you know, I told Georgianne yesterday that maybe they didn't take more pictures of Scots Kirk simply because there was hardly any damage. So why take pictures of the church that wasn't damaged? We just want to see the parts that fell down. So we only have these few views of St. Andrew Scots Kirk. Then we have the Wesley Chapel. This is the Wesley Chapel. I think this might be a school. I'm not quite sure, but this is the picture afterwards of the chapel. What you can see here, and I'll just point it out very quickly, it's these arches, and they're connecting, I think, buttresses, if I have my architecture correct, and if I'm not, I stand corrected, that kept the roof up. Everything else fell down, and I think there's remnants of an altar somewhere up here. This is the building next door to it. Notice the columns here seem to have been pretty strong, but the walls were not. And so the roof was being held up by, you know, these columns here. But it seemed to have been a very strong structure towards the base. So this is Holy Trinity Church, which again, these two buildings no longer exist. I had to do a little bit of postulate to figure out what might be in its location now. I think the St. Aloysius School might be in this location. For some of the Jamaicans, they might be able to make the connection with the location. But Gordon Hall and Holy Trinity Church, it's very interesting because these buildings were not complete more than a year. In fact, it was less than a year, and then the earthquake came and basically took it. Holy Trinity Church would have been the cathedral, had it been named cathedral at the time, but it was the main parish church, Catholic church in downtown Kingston at the time. And I will show you a picture of the earthquake. This nice bell tower is what brought the building down. So this one, no bell tower. The structure that held up the bell tower is gone. You'll see that the roof of Gordon Hall, and Gordon Hall was supposed to be sort of like a rec center, a place for the community to to come and socialize. I guess in modern times it would be the church hall, right? But then everything just fell to bits. It makes you really wonder about the construction, because the whole top floor came tumbling down, including the steps, which is very, very strange. And this is another view of the same facility. Myrtle Bank Hotel. This is very controversial hotel, but it was said they they were not very nice to people of color, but also one of the positive things about them is that after the earthquake they opened their stores and provided supplies for the city to use for the wounded and for the hungry. So that's the Myrtle Bank Hotel. And this was the destruction towards the back of the hotel caused by the earthquake. So that brings us to, why am I telling you all of this? Why am I showing you these horrific pictures about an earthquake? So it's about absence heritage. What is it? Basically, it speaks to any part of history, tangible or intangible, that has been removed, obliterated, omitted from discourse, from discussion, from our memory by virtue of not having markers or not having anything that would give it context or give it life. And so because the ideology or place has been removed, and usually in this particular instance of the description of absence heritage, it speaks primarily of it being removed, not by accident, but purposely. And that's the issue. Absence heritage tends to speak more about an intended removal from the memory of people. And so what we want is to draw absence heritage into a broader definition, to include okay. Sorry, I'm being distracted. Right, to include these aspects of our heritage that are accidentally removed by virtue of natural disasters or war or some other event, but just not because the political will decided that people should not have this, right? So some examples of the current use of absence heritage. One example that I discussed yesterday with Georgianne was some paintings I saw when I was in Barbados. And every time I go to the Barbados Museum and I go through the displays, I end up on some of these paintings. And some of them were paintings of colonial life, but it didn't have the atrocities. It didn't have the enslaved and how the enslaved were treated. It was a sort of a romantic idea of the colony. So, it showed you fields, and it showed you the sugarcane that, you used to make your sweets and all of this. But it really doesn't give you the everything else, right? So that if you were sending these paintings to England, for example, during that time, you wouldn't know of what else is happening, and this would be your memory, or at least your idea of the place. And so that is absence heritage as defined now. Another one is indigenous languages. So when you suppress indigenous languages by not allowing it to proliferate within a location, or at least, I'm not saying that it should be formalized and it should be part of your next your second language or whatever. But what if it is? But in some places it's suppressed because it's in search of a better word, it's primitive, it's savage, it doesn't belong, it's not commonplace. And so the continuous suppression of these and cultural activities that are related to this language eventually removes it from memory, and so nobody remembers it, nobody can speak it, it doesn't exist. there are also museums that have exhibitions, or living museums that have tours where people are actually participating in different things, but they leave out parts of the narrative. So a visitor to this particular space leaves with only one part of the idea of the actual event that is being contextualized and displayed, and not the entire picture. Right. An example Georgian gave me for that was the Blist Hill Living Museum. And so it draws us into this experience of absence heritage just being something somebody removed from our memory so that it doesn't exist for us to use. And I think that limits the definition, and it needs to be broadened, because we have heritage of absence that relates to so many other things other than people suppressing and creating issues. So why would we don't want Kingston earthquake of 1907 to be the example on which we're hinging absence heritage, but we are trying to use it to sort of demonstrate how this landscape could be one such example to point out some of the deficiencies of the definition. We also want to be able to say that through absence heritage, or through the awareness that is brought into being by not having the heritage being absent, we can make a people resilient. So I hope I'm bringing it home, right? So this is where I'm going to show you the images of what these buildings look like now, and hopefully it will draw you into my own experience of, oh my God, there should be something. So this is part of King Street, right? As I said, some of the buildings look very similar. We still have the same kind of idea where, remember back in the day, we had merchants in the lower sections of the buildings, and they, in terms of their shops and so on, and then the upper parts of the residences. Well, I don't think there are any residences upstairs now, but certainly you have a similar kind of, you know, walkway with these columns as you can move along. And for those who are not Jamaican, juicy patties. Patties is a very, 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 very important part of our Jamaican diet. Some of us eat patties every day. And if we manage to visit each other after COVID, maybe we'll bring boxes of these things so people could try, provided customs and immigration don't detain them. So this is, again, I wanted to point out, this is a view looking north. We had this similar view before. This is the view looking north, and this is the church that had that tall spire. Notice how much of the hillside we can see now, because the spire isn't pointing up and obliterating it, because that building, just from this view alone, shows us the changes. We can see all the modern buildings along this part of the King Street, and we're able to immediately identify that something has changed. And you might want to ask yourself, so what was here? What was over here? I can see the church. It looks different, but it's an imposing structure. I can see the hills, so it might be it. But everything else is pretty modern, at least from this view. Then here's the view closer up. This is the church. I think we had an earthquake view showing the maybe up on this side, I'm not sure, but this is the church from the sideways, and you can see no spire. Okay. This is the Coke, right? Notice still has columns. They're not as, still has towers. They're not as tall. No embellishments in the corners. You know, they learned a thing or two. You could also see that there are places where this, I think this would be built of concrete, like Portland cement kind of material. And so we're able to see that they have included, because the building is still shows a brick facing, that they did in fact incorporate some earthquake building codes within this this structure. But it's important to note that a lot of this building, a lot of it has changed. This is the Jewish synagogue. I didn't show you a pre-picture because it was not very clear, and we would spend all day trying to figure out if it's a dust cloud or an actual building. So this is what it looks like now. And this is a very imposing structure. It eventually is the one place now where the community actually meets, and it has a museum. And basically this is the building that was built post-earthquake. This is the Myrtle Bank. So they rebuilt, and it is very nice. And it basically lived until I think the 1950s, somewhere in the 60s, there was a fire and it became destroyed. There are the Jamaica Stock Exchange is in the location where the Myrtle Bank was, but there's still no signage, even to say they were despicable or they were nice or they gave sheets and food. There's nothing there to even suggest that and I haven't seen it. Maybe if it's there, somebody can correct me, but I haven't seen anything that says Myrtle Bank was here. And this is Ward Theatre. Used to be Theatre Royal. Some of the elements of the original building is still there. You can see the columns where the statues were. You can see some of these the circular windows. The circular windows that were on this side, if you remember, those the building was redesigned on these edges and those were removed in the redesign. But the building, basically, this edifice looks more or less the same as it did after the earthquake. This is the Wesley Chapel. Now, when you look at this particular building and you look at what was there before, including the two buildings that were together, this is very, very different. This is a one-story building. The previous large structure was 2 stories. The front of the edifice is quite different. Generally, some of the things on the windows on the side are the same, but in general, this building looks very, very different from the one that we saw after the earthquake. This one is the St. Andrew Scots Kirk, and the reason I'm showing you this is because the church has basically the same shape as it did back then, except that they've modified the sections along here, but you still see the portico on either side, and then you can see where this one was walled in, right? But still a pretty stable structure because of its somewhat of a hexagonal pattern. And of course, a front view of the St. Andrew Parish, the Kingston Parish Church. I keep saying St. Andrew, I don't know why. The Kingston Parish Church. And I don't know, I think it's a beautiful building. I still miss its nice little pointy spire, although I know how dangerous it was. But it feels like it's missing something, like it's not complete. I don't know if you get that. I get that feeling every time I look at it, especially after looking at what the original building looked like. And as I'm here, I will point out that remember that the apex of the fire came up to where this church was. And this is Holy Trinity Cathedral. Now, remember I said Holy Trinity Church and Gordon Hall ceased to exist. It no longer is on the street called Duke Street. It is now on North Street, and it's called Holy Trinity Cathedral. And this structure, it is nowhere near where it was before, and there was a lot of controversy about where it should have been placed, because somehow placing it where it was back in that time, it would be considered rural, even though it was probably a mile away. But anyway, what's important about this structure was the design. And if you look at the design, it would probably remind you, though small, it would probably remind you of the Hagia Sophia in Turkey, because this was designed in the Byzantine style to because of they wanted it to be earthquake resistant. After all, they lost a newly built church and a newly built church hall within a year of building it, and so they wanted to have the most secure and stable structure they could find, and this was it. So, having said that, what are some of the strategies? Because I've now pointed out to you what's missing from the story. So we have the earthquake, we have the buildings before the earthquake, we have the destroyed buildings, we have new buildings. And so, and I've showed you what they look like now. So how do we build awareness using all of this? So for one, we could use augmented reality. And we had a little conversation, I think, before we started about using such tools. And augmented reality, for example, when you look at Drain the Oceans, for example, on, I think is National Geographic, it gives us this idea of a view of things that we wouldn't ordinarily see. It takes us away from having to use our mind's eye to visualize something, but give us a rendition or a rendering of this view that allows us to see. So if you can imagine standing along King Street, looking towards the hills, and you can use your mobile device, your phone or tablet, and you would be able to see the views that I showed you of the destroyed buildings, just looking up that way, looking at the tram, seeing everything mangled. That brings us into our own awareness of the destructive nature of an earthquake and what we're up against, right? Within the context of virtual reality, we would want for people to, for example, the Natural History Museum is downtown. The National Library is downtown. We have a lot of interactive spaces. Imagine if a child could go, or a group of children or their parents, whoever, go into one of these museums. And obviously this is not COVID time, because you wouldn't want to be sharing visors during COVID time. But let's say in a safer time, you're able to put on these goggles and you are able to immerse yourself, for example, in at the Granville Hotel where Cornish was when the earthquake occurred, where he got to see his wife almost fall off kilter because of the shaking of the building. You'd be able to experience in that moment what happened to somebody who was standing in the very same location that you were at the Institute of Jamaica during the earthquake. So it's one of the things that we want. I think virtual reality could actually immerse us into that and allow us to feel how real this is and how real the destruction can be. Gamification is another way that we could actually raise awareness using these same buildings. So, I mean, there are escape games and similar kind of escape room kind of ideas these days. And if you were to, let's say, for small children, they'd be in a room, and the room would be their bedroom at Granville Hotel back in 1907, and they had to point out different things, or it could be a modern room, point out things that are dangerous in the room, and they have to do that in 30 seconds before the building falls down. And so it helps them to be aware of their surroundings and what is important in terms of what are the things that need not be there. As much as they are fantastic, they're probably death traps. And of course, after 5 seconds, your game starts shaking because the earthquake is coming. And after 10 seconds, because remember the earthquake lasted 35 seconds. So we want them to experience what 35 minutes of terror. I mean, we don't want to scare children, but certainly 35 minutes of shake, what that feels like. And after 30 seconds, sorry, 35 seconds of shaking. And after 30 seconds, if you haven't identified all the things, you can't leave the room, the building falls down, right? Hopefully, it won't be very morbid. But, it's one of the ideas that we could use. I could go all day about ideas, but signage is another very, very important thing. And so I'm going to just go to the next slide to show you just some examples of this signage. Now, one of the things, for example, on the North Coast where there was tsunami, there could be these labels as to where tsunami locations are, where it's safe to be in the event of an earthquake. Whether or not you have a tsunami warning, you should head for higher ground. Yep. And so the picture down here at the bottom is not the picture that we want, but it would be a similar picture. You want to be able to get people to appreciate what to do if. And then I like the next one just above it, where it gives you information about an event, and it gives you information about the place without giving you too much information. So it says that the square was used for sports, but it stopped being used for sports and was used for something else. And then it tells you what happened after an earthquake, and that it was, you know, temporarily used for a shopping center and what it was called. This is a normal little board in front of, it could be in front of a tavern, it could be in front of a shop, it could be in front of a church. And if you have that accompanied by an image or some kind of clicker that you can use your device to see, you know, what this building looked like before 1907 and what it looked like right after the earthquake, you know, so it's almost like January 13, January 14, and then and then whichever day that you are physically looking at this building. So it brings you into what the loss was and what you can actually identify and immerse yourself into. And then last but not least, in terms of signage, I loved this image when I saw it on the internet and I stole it immediately. It's very, very imposing. And when you look at it, it has a lot of information, but it could be interactive by having QR codes, or it doesn't have to have anything electrical on it, just QR codes, just your device pointed at a particular picture. So it would say, point your phone here. And we could have an interactive map, for example, that you could pull onto your phone as an app or otherwise. And anywhere you walk about the city, you could get a ping, and once you check on that ping and you look out, you'll be able, it will tell you, point your phone towards the courts building, and you point your phone towards the courts building and you will see an artist's rendition of the fire, or, you know, just something that will draw you into the experience that you have to you have to be prepared. Yes, I just saw Naomi's message, and it is in fact similar to the idea of Pokemon Go. Hopefully we won't go crazy as so many people did, but it certainly is a way of using what people are accustomed to. People love games. There are hundreds of thousands of games online now that people play just for entertainment. And what if while you're being entertained, you are also learning to be resilient? It would be fantastic. So, of course, just trying to wrap it all up now. We don't want this collective amnesia. We want to learn from our heritage spaces, whether they've been labeled or not. We want them to be part of the discourse. We want them labeled. We want them identified. We want to know what happened. And we might be using the earthquake today, but I'm sure we can think of other ways and other aspects of our heritage that we might not be highlighting in a particular way. But the reason we're using the earthquake is because we want earthquake awareness to be at the forefront of people's minds, because we want to have that change in behavior, and we want that change in behavior to result in resilience. So that's my conclusion. We want to expand the definition of absence heritage. We welcome other persons to come and help us to flesh this out in a way that it would be meaningful, and we can have examples from other places, so that with the writing and the use of it in this particular way, we've essentially expanded it. And we want to memorialize our spaces. And in the memorializing of these spaces, we want to increase awareness. And in increasing this awareness, as I said before, promote this modification in behavior that would then allow us to be more resilient as a population. So this is the end, and these are some of the people I would like to thank. Georgian is with us on the meeting. She's my research assistant, and she has been most helpful. Stephanie Parker was her, I would say, predecessor, and Stephanie did a lot of the legwork when we started looking into absence heritage some years ago. Dr. Leslie Gale Atkinson, whose computer unfortunately fell today, so she couldn't actually join us. So she's waiting on the actual recording. And Professor Simon Mitchell, whose archive we used for all the newspaper clippings and everything. And I got some pictures of the National Library of Jamaica online archive, and so too from Will Robson, his image archive of the 1907 earthquake. So that's it from me. I hope it was interesting. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Sherene. Congratulations. It was really interesting, and thank you for this travel in time, I will say. So we have discussions going on, lots of questions. Ben, if you want to start, I think you had remarks also.
It's always me. I just started the chat going.
Yeah.
I don't know where to start. There were so many things. Um, I can't go back over what I said. I'm thinking about it. Marie, do you have anything?
Where is Marie?
It's
It's
well, we had quite a lot of earthquakes in Mexico City, and well, I had this note about churches, how they just fall down. I mean, these colonial churches, we had quite a lot in Mexico, churches that had survived like 500 years, but they fell at the last earthquake, which was closer to the city. It was a bit different, and including they killed people that were in them. They were dangerous buildings to be still there. And I thought, well, that probably shouldn't have occurred with the old pyramids, right? The one that the indigenous people did build, right? So I don't know if they had that sense of the hazards, and they did the pyramids to avoid that. But that's some sort of thoughts I had too of how, in this sense of this area was colonized, and they built something that they imported from their home, but they didn't adapt to the circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Yeah, so that's so I think probably like destroying all this and building something over it's erasing memory, surely. But I think it's difficult to make people preserve something that is destroyed. Don't you think?
Well, it's the buildings that were not built. I'm sure there are other things in their place. And so in memorializing, using a sign, for example, because we're not going to preserve the thing, we want to have it in memory. So, for the people whose ancestry, for example, a wedding or christening or something that happened in that church, for argument's sake, but it could say for people who are passers-by that this was the location of the St. Michael's Church, which collapsed completely in the 1907 earthquake. It brings to your mind that, oh, this thing completely went away. My house could completely collapse. What else, So it draws you into that thought that something is gone that we won't get back. What else could we lose? And so as a collective community, you want to now start thinking of, what haven't I preserved? What haven't I fixed? What needs to be reinforced, so that collectively we can preserve what remains by understanding what we have lost. So that is the idea, I think.
Okay, thank you. Marie, you want to add something? Maybe
I can be all day. Yeah, I think I think a lot of it is what they do in museums, right? Right now, I remember going to Barcelona because before this, and we went into this Gaudi house, and they had this thing. It wasn't on your phone. They gave you a device, but you could see the place, like when it was when you had the old furniture and all. It was so much nice, and you could just move it and see exactly how it was before. And I thought that was so much better, so much nicer than how it is now, right? But I think it's something that that technology can do now, right? So I think we should try to speak to those people and do things for us too, in this sense. I think that's possible to do, right?
Yep, for sure. Thanks, Marie.
Okay, so I think we have also a question from Naomi. If you want to
I'm
turn.
here, I
Yeah.
think. It's 1 a.m. Hi. So I asked about churches, and are there any remaining churches that are, or like structures that were adapted? Because you mentioned a lot of these churches and they fell down. I'm asking because I want to give an example from the Philippines where we had old churches that were destroyed because of the earthquake, and then they rebuilt it. And it was during the Spanish occupation in the Philippines, so it was during the Baroque period. But what the builders did was they actually have created a new type of architecture called Philippine Baroque, which is actually a modified version of Baroque churches where they reinforced the walls, they put more buttresses, they separated the bell tower from the main church. All of these learning from past disasters that destroyed the church, they found out that a collapsing bell tower actually destroys the rest of the church. So what Philippine Baroque did was to remove the bell tower and have it like a space separated from the main church. And this is what I mean when I'm asking about local knowledge or indigenous knowledge. It's the type of architecture that is adapted to the place, considering the hazards that are present in there.
Right. So in Jamaica, there's something quite similar. And my colleague Pat Green wrote extensively about this several years ago, where she described the Jamaican vernacular architecture. And you can see from some of all the color images were the rebuilds of the churches, except for Holy Trinity and St. Michael's. And what you found was that there were several adaptations. So they did, while they had a tower, it wasn't imposing to fall over. And they also included some earthquake type mechanisms to ensure that, you know, they wouldn't have the kind of collapse that they had before. So a lot of buildings took advantage of some modern architecture. So if you go through the city, you will see buildings that were built post 1907, but they have a more modern look to them. There was one good example is there's a church in Falmouth. I can't remember the name at the moment, but it got damaged. It was a historic church that got damaged in 1957 earthquake, but the building is a very modern building and looks nothing like the original what was there before. So you have those instances where something has been made completely modern, and those where they kept the style but modified it now, because as Marie said, they now have the experience of the location. So it's no longer the transplanting of what they would love to see in their location, their home locations where they didn't have earthquakes. And one good example of that is the bringing in of the Hagia Sophia example for the rebuild of the Holy Trinity Cathedral.
Can I add one more?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so relating to absence heritage, aside from what structures we are preserving or the signages that we are putting explaining the structures, I think a lot of absence heritage relies or it's in that thing that we don't tell. So we're losing a lot of history because we stopped telling stories. And we have examples of that in the Philippines where stories of the big eruptions from Mayon, the biggest one, which is actually historical, it used to be passed down as a folk story, so oral tradition. But when we stopped doing oral tradition, nobody wrote it down. And the culture nowadays, we don't do stories with the elders anymore. And that's that story, that account of the old eruption, that's the heritage that we're losing because we don't have evidence for it. There's no outcrop, there's no buildings, but that's the story, that's the absent heritage that I think there are still some people that remember. And I hope we can try to preserve the story. And I think a big part of that is retelling the story. And the same goes with other Taal eruptions. Or, for example, I also asked if these sites are considered historical sites or cultural sites, because a lot of the churches, the earthquake baroque churches, are considered historical sites or cultural sites because they're nicely built. But what we don't talk about is why are they built that way and why are they a different kind of baroque, which is actually
Yes.
the entry point for disaster risk reduction to come in. Like these are adaptations that people have done because of past disasters. And so I think we could do work on that again with expanding the definition of absence heritage. It's not just what we're losing. It's not just what we lost, but it's actually what we're losing because we're not talking about them enough.
Yep, yep. And yes, these all the buildings I showed are in fact designated as heritage sites. They are designated heritage sites. But yes, that has formed part of the discourse as well. But you can't talk about lots of things in 40 minutes. But thanks so much for that, Naomi. Thank you.
Thank you very much.